The sirens arrived before anyone understood what had truly happened, slicing through the warm afternoon air of the coastal city like an accusation that could not be taken back. People turned their heads as police cruisers skidded to a stop outside the glass-fronted cafe, phones already lifting, whispers spreading faster than facts. Inside, a man sat calmly at a corner table, his hands resting flat on the wood, his posture straight but relaxed, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. Across the room, a young woman dabbed her eyes dramatically while her brother stood beside her, face flushed with outrage, one hand gripping his expensive phone as if it were a weapon of its own. Ethan Caldwell had never been told no in his life. Growing up in a world where money smoothed every inconvenience and influence bent rules in his favor, he had learned early that authority usually listened to him first. His family name carried weight in the city: real estate, tech investments, charity galas with their name etched into marble plaques. When Ethan walked into a room, people noticed. When he spoke, people complied. And when his younger sister Lily burst into tears that afternoon, trembling as she claimed a stranger had attacked her, Ethan didn't hesitate for a second. He made the call himself, his voice sharp and certain, already picturing consequences for the man she pointed at. The man looked ordinary enough, which somehow made Ethan angrier. He wore faded jeans, a plain gray shirt, and shoes that had clearly seen better days. His hair was cropped short, flecked with early gray, and his face carried lines that suggested years of sun, stress, or both. He didn't argue when the officers approached. He didn't shout or protest or even look surprised. He simply stood when asked, turned around, and placed his hands behind his back with practiced ease. That calmness unsettled Ethan more than any outburst could have. It felt wrong, like a refusal to play the role Ethan had already assigned him. Lily clutched Ethan's arm as the cuffs clicked shut, her nails digging into his sleeve. She whispered about how scared she had been, how the man had grabbed her wrist when she walked past his table, how she had frozen in shock. Her voice wavered just enough to sound real, and Ethan squeezed her shoulder protectively, glaring at the man as if daring him to deny it. But the man didn't look at Lily. His eyes remained forward, steady, unreadable, as the officers guided him toward the door. Outside, the scene grew louder. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the spectacle of flashing lights and raised voices. Someone shouted a question. Someone else took a photo. Ethan felt a strange sense of satisfaction as he watched the man placed into the back of the cruiser. This was how the world worked, he told himself. You protected your own. You acted fast. You used the power you had. If a lesson needed to be taught, so be it. The man's name was Daniel Cross, though no one bothered to ask him that at the cafe. At the station, he gave it quietly, along with his address and a calm statement that he had not attacked anyone. He said he had seen the young woman stumble, instinctively reached out to steady her, and immediately let go when she pulled back. He spoke without anger, without accusation, as if explaining the weather. The officers exchanged glances, used to far louder protests. One of them, a veteran with tired eyes, noticed Daniel's posture, the way he stood even while cuffed, balanced and alert without appearing tense. It was familiar, though the officer couldn't place why just yet. Ethan arrived at the station an hour later with a lawyer already on speakerphone and his father's influence trailing behind him like a shadow. He repeated Lily's story, confidently, insisting charges be pressed, demanding swift action. Lily sat beside him, eyes red, shoulders shaking. The officers listened, took notes, nodded. This wasn't their first encounter with the Caldwells. Things tended to move quickly when that name was involved. Daniel sat alone in a holding room, staring at the scuffed floor, his mind far from the sterile walls around him. He had learned long ago that reacting emotionally rarely helped. In places much worse than this, patience had kept people alive. He thought of the coffee he hadn't finished, of the quiet afternoon he'd hoped for. He thought of how easily moments twisted when fear met assumption. And somewhere deep inside, a familiar ache surfaced, the weight of knowing that sometimes doing the right thing still carried a cost. As the hours passed, small inconsistencies began to surface. A barista mentioned that she hadn't seen any struggle, only a brief moment of contact. A customer recalled Lily looking at her phone just before she cried out. Security footage from the cafe showed Daniel's hand reaching out, Lily stumbling, and then pulling away, her face changing from surprise to something else entirely. The footage had no sound, no clear proof of intent, just a few seconds that could be interpreted in more than one way. Ethan dismissed these details when they were mentioned to him. He accused the staff of protecting one of their own, questioned the camera angles, suggested editing. He had never liked uncertainty. It made him feel powerless, and powerlessness was something he avoided at all costs. Lily stayed quiet, her gaze fixed on the floor, her hands twisting in her lap. Every now and then, she looked toward the holding area, guilt flickering across her face like a warning light she refused to acknowledge. The turning point came quietly, almost unnoticed at first. One of the officers ran Daniel's name through the system and paused when the results came back. There were no priors, no red flags. But there was a notation. Service record, sealed but verifiable. The officer leaned closer to the screen, his brow furrowing. He called over a colleague, then a supervisor. Whispers replaced assumptions. Daniel Cross wasn't just any civilian. He was a retired Navy SEAL, honorably discharged after years of service that most people would never hear about. Missions classified, commendations earned in silence, injuries endured without complaint. He had returned home years ago, choosing anonymity over recognition, working odd jobs, volunteering quietly, trying to live a life where his past didn't define every interaction. When the supervisor informed Ethan of this fact, he expected outrage or embarrassment. Instead, he saw something else. Confusion, followed by a crack in the certainty Ethan wore like armor. A Navy SEAL. The words didn't fit the image Ethan had constructed in his mind. He thought of the man's calm demeanor, his lack of resistance. For the first time since the cafe, doubt crept in. Lily's reaction was more immediate. Her breath caught, and tears spilled over, real this time. She shook her head, whispering that she hadn't known, that she hadn't meant for things to go this far. The weight of her lie, small at first, now pressed down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. She looked at her brother, silently begging him to understand what she couldn't yet say out loud. Ethan felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. He had always believed himself to be a good person, someone who stood up for family, who supported charities, who did the right thing when it mattered. But sitting there, hearing the truth unravel, he was forced to confront the possibility that his actions, driven by privilege and assumption, had caused real harm to someone who didn't deserve it. The supervisor made it clear that the investigation would continue, that charges were far from certain. Ethan's lawyer suggested backing off, letting things cool down. For once, Ethan didn't argue. His gaze drifted to the door of the holding room, where Daniel still sat quietly, unaware of the conversation unfolding outside. When Daniel was finally released pending further review, he stepped out into the evening air with the same measured calm he'd maintained all day. The sky had turned orange and purple, the city buzzing with life that had gone on without him. He took a deep breath, feeling the familiar mix of relief and resignation. He had survived worse than false accusations, but that didn't mean they didn't hurt. Ethan approached him hesitantly, his confidence replaced by something closer to humility. For a moment, neither spoke. The distance between them felt heavier than any words. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat and apologized, not the polished, performative apologies he'd given at press conferences or charity events, but a halting, imperfect one that acknowledged fault without excuses. He admitted he'd acted without listening, without questioning, without considering the man in front of him as a human being. Daniel listened, really listened, his eyes steady but not unkind. When Ethan finished, Daniel nodded once. He didn't lecture. He didn't demand restitution. He simply said that fear often made people see monsters where there were none, and that the real test of character came not in avoiding mistakes, but in how one chose to respond after making them. Lily stepped forward then, her voice barely audible as she confessed the truth. She admitted she had panicked, embarrassed by her stumble, startled by the contact, and had let her fear turn into accusation. She apologized through tears, ashamed and frightened of the consequences her lie had nearly created. Daniel told her that honesty, even when it came late, still mattered. He hoped she would remember this moment the next time fear tempted her to take the easier path. The charges were dropped days later, the footage and testimonies clearing Daniel completely. The story made a brief appearance in local news, though the headlines were far less dramatic than the initial arrest. Ethan watched the coverage from his office, feeling the sting of public scrutiny for the first time. It wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in him. He found himself questioning assumptions, listening more carefully, noticing the quiet ways people carried their own battles. He reached out to Daniel again, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to make amends. He offered help, resources, money, things he knew how to give. Daniel declined most of it, but accepted an invitation to speak at a community event Ethan helped organize, focused on understanding, accountability, and the unseen costs of judgment. That night, as Daniel spoke to a room full of strangers, his words simple and sincere, Ethan watched from the back, feeling a strange sense of gratitude. One careless accusation had turned into a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. He understood now that true strength wasn't about power or influence, but about empathy, humility, and the courage to admit when you were wrong. When the event ended, people lined up to thank Daniel, some shaking his hand, others hugging him. Ethan waited until the crowd thinned, then approached quietly. Daniel smiled at him, a small, genuine smile that carried no bitterness. In that moment, Ethan realized that compassion wasn't just something you gave, it was something you learned, often the hard way. As they parted, the city lights glowing around them, Ethan felt hopeful in a way he never had before. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could choose what came next. And Daniel, walking home under the same lights, felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that even painful moments could ripple outward into understanding, if people were willing to listen. Sometimes, it wasn't the strongest punch or the loudest voice that changed a life. Sometimes, it was the steady presence of someone who chose grace over anger, truth over fear, and humanity over judgment. And in a world quick to accuse and slow to understand, that choice made all the difference.